Since I was very young, I knew I wasn't liked in this family. Being an Omega, the offspring of an Alpha, was considered a disgrace. We were invited by the Crescent Pack to the Harvest Festival. When I was ready, Mom and Dad had already taken Abelard and Delilah into the car and were about to leave. I stood in front of the car and softly reminded them, "Mom, I'm not in the car yet. Are you going to?" Mom frowned, her impatience clear. "There's no more room in the car. You stay home to look after the house." I was only 5 at the time, but I had already developed a vague sense of others' emotions because I was an Omega and no one liked me, even if that person was my own mother. And now, at my sister's wedding, after exchanging pleasantries with some guests, Mom retreated to a corner, turning her back and repeatedly calling me. No one answered. By the third call, it was directly disconnected. She seemed strangled by disbelief, unable to accept that her authority as a Luna was being challenged. "Peaches, I'm your mother." My brother Abelard came over and gently patted her back. "Mom, don't be upset. It's not worth it for Peaches. Don't you know by now?" She's just like that. Mom's anger and frustration finally found an outlet through her most beloved youngest son. "You 3 kids, I've invested the most effort in Peaches. When she was born, she was supposed to be a twin. Even the doctors said she survived only by taking the nutrients meant for your brother. But in the end, she turned out to be just an Omega, which really brought me shame. I've heard this countless times from her since I was little. In the end, I would often be punished and locked in my room while the rest of the family went out for a day of leisure. Is it my fault for being an Omega? I don't understand why they are so harsh with me. Mom, don't be angry. Don't worry, even if I have to drag her back, I will." Abelard comforted Mom and then sent me numerous messages. "Peaches, you'd better show up within an hour. How can you be so selfish? You know Mom has a heart condition and yet you keep upsetting her. Are you still thinking about Alpha Spike? Besides, isn't Delilah your sister too?" After sending that message, his fingers paused on the keyboard. A few seconds later, he put away his phone and turned to help greet the guests. Yes, even he probably doesn't believe it. Delilah is his good sister and a good daughter to Mom and Dad. How could she be my sister? Downstairs, the guests were drinking and dancing, and my wolf, Hope, looked on with envy. Even in death, she stayed by my side. We drifted upstairs and saw Delilah in the makeup room. The makeup artist was touching up her slightly faded eye makeup. She held onto our Alpha father's hand, her eyes misty. "Dad, is Peachy really not coming? She's my sister, and on this most important day for me, I truly wish she could be here to bless me. If possible, I'd like to introduce some Alphas to her as well." Our father, usually stern and distant with me, patted her shoulder and gently reassured her. "She will come. I'll have Abel contact her. I won't let you have any regrets." He found Abelard in the hallway, his face set in a stern expression. "Tell Peaches that if she doesn't come today, we'll act as if we never had this daughter. An Omega defying an Alpha, what kind of behavior is that?" "Dad, she isn't even responding to my messages, and she's not answering Mom's calls." Abelard said through gritted teeth. "I knew it. An Omega like her has no conscience. She only agreed to come to give us false hope, to ruin the most important day for her sister." Today was Delilah's most significant day. She was about to marry Alpha Spike, the man she had been in love with for 2 years. 2 years ago, when I brought my mate, Alpha Spike, home, Delilah had fallen for him at first sight. I still remember the moment she saw Alpha Spike, her eyes lit up. That night, she made an excuse to go running with me. We ran through the mountains in our wolf forms. Beside me, she whispered urgently, "Peachy, I'm in love with Alpha Spike at first sight. You're an Omega, unworthy of such a powerful Alpha. Besides, your wolf is so weak you can't even support him as a Luna. Please, let Alpha Spike go to me." I refused. He was my mate, and I couldn't simply give him up to someone else. But soon after, Alpha Spike rejected me. I, Spike, Alpha of the Crescent Pack, reject you, Peaches of the Eclipse Pack, as my mate and Luna. My wolf, Hope, also howled in anguish. I couldn't understand why, when we were destined to be mates by the moon goddess, Alpha Spike would reject me. The pain enveloped my whole body. I could barely stand, but I fought to remain upright, refusing to kneel and embarrass myself in front of him. I kept demanding an explanation, and he was probably irritated by my persistence, shoving my hand away. I fell to the ground, the rough surface scraping my palms painfully. He remained indifferent, staring at me with distaste, still trying to hide it from me. "Even your family can't stand you," and told me the truth. One morning, my mother suddenly called me out to go grocery shopping. My brother, Abelard, had dragged Alpha Spike along and revealed some truths about me. moral corruption, stealing money from home, bullying weaker classmates, having inappropriate relationships with other werewolves, and even once being pregnant. I fell to the ground, the rough surface scraping my palms painfully. He remained indifferent, staring at me with distaste, still trying to hide it from me. Even your family can't stand you, and told me the truth. One morning, my mother suddenly called me out to go grocery shopping. My brother, Abelard, had dragged Alpha Spike along and revealed some truths about me. Moral corruption, stealing money from home, bullying weaker classmates, having inappropriate relationships with other werewolves, and even once being pregnant. Because I am an Omega, I am inherently morally corrupt. Because I survived by taking the nutrients meant for my Alpha brother, I am inherently guilty. Alpha Spike never had deep feelings for me, and the ones who spoke ill of me were my own family. My dearest and closest family. While I was alive, they cared not at all. And now, in death, no one notices. It's just an inconsequential Omega who has died. No. As they speaking, Alpha Spike arrived. Dressed in a suit and with a carefully styled hairstyle, he appeared even taller and more handsome. He kissed Delilah on the cheek and gently asked, "Has Peaches still not arrived? Where could an Omega go?" Delilah nodded with tears in her eyes. "Forget about her." Alpha Spike's expression darkened. "Such a lowly Omega would only tarnish our wedding. Delilah, you are the most beautiful werewolf bride today. Don't waste tears on someone unworthy." Delilah wrapped her arms around his neck, tilting her face up with a sad expression. "No matter what, even if she's a terrible Omega, Peachy is still my sister." Her expression seemed genuinely heartfelt. Just like 3 years ago, when I was an outstanding graduate werewolf and the school requested that my Alpha father and Luna mother attend the graduation ceremony, speak on stage, and facilitate school photos for publicity. I carefully organized my words and called home to make the request. Mom agreed, but on the morning of the event, she called to say that she and Dad couldn't come. "Delilah is sick. We can't leave her alone at home." In the video call, Delilah, with a pale face, looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry, Peachy. I'm not feeling well. You've always been so independent. Even without Mom and Dad, I know you can handle it." "Peachy, congratulations on your graduation. How could I be happy? On my graduation day, I apologized to my teachers, the school, and all the werewolf friends who had prepared so long for the event." As I walked past the cameras, I overheard werewolves complaining. "The whole schedule was rehearsed, and now we have to redo everything. What rubbish. So-called outstanding graduate looks to me like the Alpha, and Luna don't even like this daughter, and didn't he want to come?" By the end of the ceremony, I took out my phone and saw a social media post from Delilah. "It was just a slight cold, but Mom and Dad took such good care of me. Life's small joys." The photo was of the three of them together. The background was Delilah's bedroom. They hadn't even gone to the hospital. What a serious illness. Soft piano music played in the banquet hall as all the werewolves watched the happy wedding of the newlyweds. Delilah, in her long mermaid-style wedding dress, walked toward Alpha Spike, holding a large bouquet of white roses. After the speeches from Mom and Dad, it was Abelard's turn. He stood on stage and jokingly waved a fist at Alpha Spike. "I only have one sister. She's the treasure of the family. If you mistreat her, the whole family won't let you off the hook." Spike gazed at Delilah with an intensely pain of this life before dying. I simply watched coldly, feeling hollow inside, as if a breeze had blown through me. At one of the tables, someone whispered, "Hey, I thought the Neal family had 3 children. Why does Abelard say he only has one sister?" "It's that second daughter, Peaches. She's a lowly Omega who's done nothing but bad things. Character is what truly matters. Thanks to my parents, I became infamous throughout the entire pack. Actually, when I was little, my aunt was quite kind to me." Affectionate tone. "I would never dream of it." Applause erupted from the audience. The stage was filled with warmth. My spirit stood by the bouquet on the edge of the stage, numb as I watched them. Everyone was smiling, everyone was avoiding mentioning me, this Omega who shamed the Alpha. My wolf howled in sorrow. She loved Alpha Spike so much that even though he had rejected us and married my sister, she couldn't forget him. I thought I would feel heartache, but perhaps I had already endured all the. For Christmas, she gave me a plush lion toy. I was the only one who received it. Abelard and Delilah didn't have one. Abelard, used to getting his way, demanded I let him play with it. When I refused, he simply tore the toy apart. Not long after, my aunt returned to retrieve a hat she had forgotten, and happened to see the torn pieces scattered on the floor. To protect her beloved son's reputation, my mom told my aunt Peachy didn't like the toy and insisted on tearing it apart. She said she Didn't he want to see it? My aunt's expression immediately changed, and from then on, she would skip giving me gifts at every gathering. In the afternoon, the wedding concluded successfully. After sending the guests off, my alpha father immediately darkened his expression and continued urging my mother to call me. I had brought the greatest embarrassment to his alpha life. Delilah's eyes were red, and the few rhinestones at the corners of her eyes glistened with tears. She held my father's hand and spoke soothingly, "Let it go, Dad. Peachy is still just a child, she might just be throwing a tantrum. As her sister, I shouldn't hold it against her." Indeed, a rare glimmer of tenderness crossed my father's usually indifferent face. Abelard, clearly displeased, said, "Sis, you're just thinking too highly of her. You treat her like a sister, but has she ever treated you as one?" Delilah bit her lip, looking as if she were on the verge of tears. I stood by, watching her, and felt a deep sense of irony. Delilah was always like this. The favoritism shown to her by the family was so blatant that it could not be ignored, yet she still felt it wasn't enough. I knew she despised me, resenting me for every perceived slight, blaming me for killing our brother, and using my Omega status as the perfect scapegoat. At first, my mother, though she didn't like me, wasn't so harsh. On my birthdays, she would bring home a cake to celebrate. But just as I was about to make a wish with the lit candles, Delilah suddenly burst into tears. She wiped her tears away and forced a brave smile. "It's nothing," she said. "I just remembered that today should have been a celebration for both of us. Poor little brother." Her words made my mother's face change instantly. I clasped my hands together, ready to make my wish, when my mother abruptly snatched away the candles. "Eat, eat, eat. All you ever do is eat. Do you even have a heart, Peaches? Your brother died because of you." I was stunned, staring at her in shock. My mother, even angrier, swept the cake into the trash. After she went to her room, I looked at Delilah through tear-filled eyes. With no one else around, she finally revealed her true feelings. At 10 years old, Delilah's face, though still bearing a gentle smile, spoke with a venomous edge. "Peaches, why did you have to be born?" She brushed her warm fingers across my face, and then suddenly pinched it hard. "Mom and Dad used to love only me. Now, you've taken their love away. You should have died with your brother." I could never understand why she hated me so much. Yet, after Abelard was born, she treated him with such kindness. When I was in college and Abelard was about to start high school, the most crucial year, my father was preoccupied with dealing with a pack of invading wolves, and my mother was focused on training soldiers to assist him. My mother insisted that I drop out of college to take care of Abelard, but I refused. She looked at me with cold, piercing eyes. "Peaches, don't you understand the situation with the pack? How can you be so selfish?" After I went to college, Delilah, now 22, suddenly decided she wanted to learn the piano. My mother had my bed and wardrobe thrown out and packed my clothes into storage. My bedroom was transformed into Delilah's piano room. She posted a video on social media of herself sitting at a new, expensive piano, bathed in sunlight, her smile serene. When I called back, my mother, still angry that I wouldn't listen to her, spoke coldly. "Now that you're so independent and refuse to listen to me, why should we keep your room? You don't plan on coming home anyway." Delilah took the phone. "Peachy, please don't upset Mom. When you come back, you can share a room with me. We'll make sure you have a place to stay." Even though she tried hard to hide it, there was still a hint of amusement in her voice. Just a month after I left, she was eager to have me out of the house, and my mother chose to silently approve and indulge her. In the afternoon, Delilah went back to their pack with Alpha Spike, becoming the Luna of the Crescent Pack. Meanwhile, I followed behind my parents and Abelard. Abelard drove while my parents sat in the back seat. The empty front passenger seat had always been reserved for Delilah. I sat there, listening to their conversation as they discussed my transgressions. "She hates me so much, hates this family. She couldn't even bring herself to attend her sister's wedding. Even though she's an Omega, we've never treated her poorly. We've raised her all these years, what more could she want?" My mother, tired, leaned on my father's shoulder. "I feel like my parenting has been a complete failure." My father patted her gently. "A wolf that can't be tamed isn't worth your worry." I turned my head and scrutinized their faces, searching for even a hint of concern. But there was none. My sudden disappearance only seemed to stir up their anger and disdain. No one, not for a second, questioned, "Am I in trouble?" Even as a mere soul, I find myself shedding tears. I cry and ask, "Mom, did you really, truly ever love me? Why did you bring me into this world if you hated me so much?" I had asked this question before, a long time ago. Back when I was in the third year of middle school, a stressful year with exams. My father was out patrolling, Abelard was still young, and Delilah had just started college. My mother was injured and I spent my days running between campus and the hospital, exhausted and losing weight. My mother seemed moved. That month she gave me more pocket money than Abelard. When she met the neighbors, she praised me repeatedly, saying how understanding and filial I was. When I was bullied on campus, she even came to my defense. It seemed like things were finally improving. Until one afternoon, while we were crossing the street, she suddenly reached out and affectionately patted my head, like other loving mothers do with their daughters. This display of maternal affection was so alien to me that I instinctively thought she was about to hit me as she had in the past. I swatted her hand away, causing her to stumble back. It was dusk. The green light had turned red. A car sped past us. My mother's gaze shifted, returning to its familiar coldness. She said, with a distant tone, just as I thought, a wolf that can't be tamed. It seemed like things were finally improving. Until one afternoon, while we were crossing the street, she suddenly reached out and affectionately patted my head, like other loving mothers do with their daughters. This display of maternal affection was so alien to me that I instinctively thought she was about to hit me as she had in the past. I swatted her hand away, causing her to stumble back. It was dusk. The green light had turned red. A car sped past us. My mother's gaze shifted, returning to its familiar coldness. She said, with a distant tone, just as I thought, a wolf that can't be tamed. That night, I was consumed by regret and confusion, unable to find solace even in pain. I clawed at my arms, creating several gashes, hoping the physical pain would ease my inner turmoil. Finally, I went to my mother's room and asked, "Mom, if you didn't love me, why did you bring me into this world?" She kept her eyes closed and remained silent. I knew she wasn't asleep, even when I was alive. She disdainfully avoided answering. Now that I'm gone, she can't hear me, and she certainly won't respond. After dinner, Abelard called me again. This time, it was answered. His anger finally had an outlet. "Peaches, you disgusting Omega, you didn't come home for the wedding, upsetting Mom and Dad. Do you think you're so important that playing games with us is fun?" There was a moment of silence. Then a hoarse male voice came through. "I'm her mate. She says that your entire family is repulsive, and that she won't be coming back to see you. Don't call again." The call ended. Abelard stared in disbelief, then, after a moment, furiously kicked over a chair and cursed. But I was already paralyzed, my strength entirely drained. The instant that voice came through, I was forcibly dragged back into that memory. Before I died, I missed the last bus because of working overtime. I had no choice but to take a taxi home. At that moment, Father S. Beta, Colin, stopped his car in front of me. "I'm headed that way anyway. I can give you a ride." I was grateful to this uncle. He was one of the few who treated me fairly. At first, everything seemed normal. Colin chatted with me as he usually did. Then, Delilah suddenly called. As the bride-to-be, she couldn't resist taking one last jab at me before the wedding. "Peachy, tomorrow I'm marrying Alpha Spike. I'm so excited I can hardly sleep." Her voice was soft and sweet. "Thanks for bringing him home." I pressed my lips together, my voice laced with anger. "Delilah, how many more times will you play these disgusting games and use these dirty tricks before you're satisfied?" She seemed completely oblivious. Her tone remained light and cheerful. "Well, it's settled then. You must come to the wedding. Tomorrow." I hung up the phone, unable to control my rapid breathing, my chest heaving violently. Colin suddenly spoke. "Another fight with your family." Frowning, I looked up and realized the car had somehow driven into a desolate countryside. My heart began to race and I forced myself to stay calm, asking him, "Uncle Colin, this doesn't seem like the way to my house?" He smiled. "Of course it's not the way to your house. It's the way to hell." I couldn't believe that a usually kind uncle would suddenly turn against me. He shifted into his wolf form and grabbed me. I despised my helplessness as a small Omega, my limbs trembling and unable to evade a Beta-esque grip. He dragged me into the small forest. The night wind was still and the moonlight fell softly. He held my neck tightly while striking me hard across the face. "You filthy bitch, do you regret leaving me now? How dare you look down on me? Beg for mercy, bark like a dog, and maybe I'll let you go." But I couldn't even understand his words. Each sentence sounded so foreign to me. "What are you talking about? You must have the wrong person." His grip on my neck suddenly loosened and turned into a gentle caress on my face. "I'm your mate, don't you recognize me? Faye Glisson." I froze. Faye Glisson. My mother. Summoning all my strength, I managed to reach for my phone. I pressed the shortcut to call the last number dialed. The phone rang twice before Delilah's rejecting the call. She promptly hung up. Realizing something was off, the man cruelly laughed, shoved the phone into his pocket, and then began to break each of my fingers. In his pocket, there was also a spring-loaded knife. As I remained conscious, I felt the blade cutting into my left wrist, slowly tearing it apart. The knife's tip sliced across my cheek, peeling away the skin in jagged strips. He said, "You worthless slut, let us see how you use this face to lure other werewolves." Now, I don't remember if I died from pain or from blood loss. All I recall from that night is the wind sweeping across the barren land, howling past my exposed, bloodied face. Perhaps people think of pleasant things before they die. I found myself lost in memories from before I was 5. After I was born, my mother, suffering from postpartum depression, couldn't bear to look at me and sent me to the countryside. There my elderly grandmother lived alone. She was the kindest person in my world, giving me all the warmth I had ever known. She would pick fresh raspberries from the trees, wash them, and place them in a small basket by my bedside for me to enjoy. I remember her calling to say that Delilah wanted raspberries, but they were unavailable at the market. My grandmother said, "Oh dear, we've had too little rain this year, so the raspberries haven't grown." After hanging up, the playful old woman winked at me and smiled. I always remember the taste of that night on my tongue. But when I was 5, my grandmother passed away. Abelard was only 3, and my mother was forced to bring me back home. From then on, she looked upon me with disfavor. I heard my mother whisper to my father, "Does this child really have a problem? Even her grandmother died because of her." I stared at her numbly. At 5, I didn't truly understand life and death. I only knew that no one would ever choose me over others. With unwavering certainty. From then on, I was a child never to be favored. In the next breath, as my life ceased, my soul was pulled by the wind, drifting out of my body. I saw the man pull an axe from the trunk of the car and sever the bones connecting my limbs. I saw a train speeding across the quiet fields under the starry sky. I saw a little girl in a house lit by countless lights suddenly wake from a nightmare, crying out once before being pulled into her parents' embrace, comforted and soothed. At the end, I saw Delilah waking up from her bed, yawning. Under my mother's urging, she washed up and changed into her wedding dress. I was back. Even in death, I returned to this home, attending Delilah's wedding. My father's beta assaulted me, killed me, dismembered me, and took my phone. Abelard remained unaware of these events. He simply told my father with a cold expression, "Peaches won't even answer my calls. She made her mate tell me she finds our family disgusting." My father was furious, slamming his hand on the table and cursing me as a worthless omega. It seemed that those in high positions were often superstitious. He favored Delilah because her birth brought rapid expansion and abundant resources to his territory, multiplying its wealth. Conversely, my birth had brought attacks from other wolf packs, nearly costing him his life. His aversion to me, and the belief that I was unlucky, was thus understandable. My father controlled the finances of the entire pack. This allowed Delilah to attend grand social balls in luxurious evening gowns, mingling with alphas. Abelard participated in Royal Guard training with alpha heirs from various packs. Meanwhile, I worked tirelessly day and night just to cover my living expenses. In the following days, I remained in this home, coldly observing their normal lives. I watched as my mother called Delilah, asking what she wanted to eat when she came home. Delilah, with a hint of childishness, requested mangoes. While my mother was at the morning market, she happened to run into our childhood neighbor, who was out shopping with her daughter, Lola. Lola and I had been classmates since childhood and later worked at the same company. We weren't close friends, but we were familiar with each other. My mother enviously remarked, "Having a daughter like Lola is truly considerate. She helps with the shopping as soon as she returns. Unlike Peaches, who refuses to come home even for her sister's wedding and has a mate to insult us." "Wait." Lola looked surprised. "Luna, Peaches doesn't have a mate." My mother froze, staring at her. "She works in the medical department and is always swamped. How could she possibly have time to socialize?" She continued, "Besides, Peaches cares about you. She saved up for months, and when we went shopping, she bought a diamond necklace, saying she planned to give it to you when she came home for your sister's wedding." The look of bewilderment on my mother's face was fleeting, quickly replaced by the familiar icy disdain. "She only puts on a show for outsiders. You have no idea how she acts at home." Seeing this, Lola and her mother had nothing more to say and left politely. My mother bought many mangoes, Delilah's favorite, and carried 2 large bags home. At the door, she took out her keys to unlock it. Her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Luna Faye, the Silver Blade Pack has found Peach's body. Please come to claim it." We detected Beta Colin S scent on the body and have apprehended him. Please come as soon as possible. In my most rebellious and extreme teenage years, I often anguished over the thought. If I were to die, would they regret it? Would my mother shed even a single tear for me? Now I finally know. After the guard's words, she simply replied, "Oh," and then hung up. As if nothing had happened, she opened the door, brought the mangoes inside, and began peeling them. Perhaps by accident, she cut her finger while peeling. She held up her injured finger and went to the living room to get the first aid kit. It was then that Abelard pushed the door open. He looked panic-stricken and helpless, his lips trembling. "Mom, Peaches." "Oh, I just received a call from a stranger saying Peaches is dead," my mother said while searching for a bandage. "What nonsense. Peaches is living better than anyone. Don't these scammers check their facts before calling?" "Mom, they're not scammers. Peaches is really dead," Abelard said, his voice full of pain. The Alpha Gabriel of the Silver Blade Pack called Dad and me. "Dad is driving home now." My mother's movements halted abruptly. She looked up at Abelard. The sunlight outside streamed in, casting shadows over the fine lines around her eyes, falling into the cold gaze she always directed at me. This ambiguous expression remained until they got into the car and drove to the Silver Blade Pack. My mother was not a silent person, but she was unusually quiet throughout the drive. Delilah held her hand and gently comforted her. "Mom, death is irreversible. Peachy wouldn't want to see you like this." For the first time, my mother ignored her beloved eldest daughter's words. Indifferently, she pulled her hand away. Delilah stiffened, her eyes filled with sadness and resentment. Upon arriving at the Silver Blade Pack, Alpha Gabriel and Beta Eddie greeted them. Alpha Gabriel first comforted my mother before informing her that my body had been found. "Luna Faye, we've done what we could to stitch her up, but some of the remains were taken by Beta Colin. According to his own admission, it might." He faltered, a flicker of reluctance crossing his eyes. My mother looked at him and asked the first question she had spoken during the entire journey. "Might what? Maybe it was cooked." My mother nodded. Perhaps her calm demeanor was far more than the police had anticipated. The young officer had turned back to glance at her twice on the way. My remains had been stitched together and cleaned, but due to the torture endured in life, the face and features were now a blur and the limbs were swollen. The smell of the corpse was far from pleasant. The moment she saw me, Delilah couldn't help but cover her mouth and ran outside, leaning against the wall and dry heaving. "Suspect Colin is your husband's Beta." According to him, he had been observing Peaches for a month before the attack to ensure he wouldn't be detected, and then disposed of the body in our territory to destroy the evidence. "But your daughter's body wasn't buried very deep. It rained a few days ago, and the rain washed it out. A person collecting mushrooms in the woods discovered her." I remembered. Why it felt familiar. About a month ago, I had seen strange people near my office. That afternoon, the sky drizzled lightly. As I left the office building, my mother called, saying Delilah was having her wedding in a month. She demanded that I return home. I couldn't help but laugh. "I've been away for 6 months, and no one from your family has contacted me. Why should I come back now?" My mother, enraged, said, "Peaches, you really don't know what's good for you. This is your home too." "Is this my home? The one where I can only set up a small bed next to Delilah's piano every time I return. The place where, if I took the last chicken wing from the plate, my father would slam his chopsticks and scold me for being uncouth. I had once stained the sofa cover during my period, and my mother had looked at me with disdain, telling me to clean it up myself after I was done. Is this what home is like? Mom, I don't have a home." I said this with a smile and hung up. In the rain a few steps away, a familiar figure stood in a black coat, wearing a mask, their face somewhat blurred. In the moment our eyes met, he instinctively turned his head away. But at that moment, my chest was filled with a pang of aching emotion, leaving me oblivious to the stranger's odd behavior. So, he had been watching me for a long time. But why? He was my father's Beta, the only person in the entire pack who had been fair to me as I grew up. Why would he do this to me? The pain from that night seemed to return. This time, it descended upon my light, drifting soul. I curled up in the air, my body feeling as though it were leaking wind from 1,000 wounds. It hurt, more than that night. Yet I couldn't help but lift my head and fix my gaze on my mother's expression. Even now, I was searching. Would she regret it? Would she be sad? Would she feel even a fraction of my pain? Under the guidance of the werewolf guards, my mother went to see the captured Beta Colin. His motives were simple and straightforward. He had once been my mother's mate, but she had rejected him, and chosen my alpha father instead. From then on, he had spiraled into extreme madness, putting on the mask of a good old friend to gain my father's trust, pretending to have moved on from my mother. Behind the glass, the interrogation room was bathed in cold, harsh light. He lifted his head, looked at my mother, and suddenly grinned, as if he knew there was no escape for him. He wanted others to share in his suffering. In front of my mother, he began to recount the details of my death. I accidentally let her get the phone and make a call. Fortunately, the other side hung up. Was it a call to you? Your daughter looked so beautiful when she cried, just like you, so I skinned her face. She was in so much pain that she couldn't even cry anymore and kept calling for her mother. The werewolf guard barked, enough. No disrespect to Luna. My mother stood in front of the glass, her back still straight, her eyes fixed on the perpetrator. She said nothing and shed no tears. I floated in front of her, face to face. She couldn't see me or hear me. I said, "Mom, I hate you." That night, the night I was violated and then dismembered while still alive, I experienced the most excruciating pain a human could endure. Blood poured out, turning my vision completely crimson. A beastly, desperate howl erupted from my throat. The wind's howl, the chirping of insects, withered leaves rustling down, fungi growing on damp wood. An orchestra of countless noises pounded like drums in my ears, deafening. I kept calling out, "Mom, Mom, Mom, it hurts so much. Help me, Mom, help me." In moments of utter despair, humans instinctively call out such names, hoping for a miracle. But none came. You were at home, in your warm bed, dreaming a sweet dream. Dreaming of your beloved eldest daughter Delilah getting married and living a happy life. Abelard was pursuing a stable relationship, studying at a very good university. After graduation, he would succeed his father as the next alpha. In your dreams, I was always absent. After leaving the police station, they went to my apartment to sort through my belongings, following the address provided by the authorities. I had stayed here after graduation, living and working for 2 whole years. They had never visited. Sitting in the car, my mother suddenly called out, "Delilah." Delilah looked at her anxiously, her eyes betraying an unmistakable guilt. "Was that call Peaches made before she died meant for you?" Delilah opened her mouth but couldn't find her voice. Even the usually articulate Delilah couldn't come up with a suitable excuse. Finally, she said, "I had to wake up at 4 for makeup, so I went to bed early. I might have accidentally hung up in my sleep." She squeezed out a few tears, making her sorrow seem genuine. My mother nodded and fell silent, as if it were merely a casual inquiry. Of course, she called Delilah Delilah, never Delilah. When speaking of me, she always used my full name. I sat in the car, slowly recovering from the recent agonizing pain. Delilah's eyes glistened with faint tears. I drifted through memories, recalling the names of the 3 of us. Delilah was their cherished first child. Abelard was a blessing from God. And my name. Less than 24 hours after birth, my brother stopped breathing. Twin. The doctor said it was due to the poor development of the fetus in the womb, which led to organ failure. Beside the sickbed, an elderly woman shared her wisdom. This situation is usually because one child took all the nutrients from the other. I've seen it in the countryside during my years as a midwife. Look at your daughter, she turned out so well. My mother leaned against the headboard, her gaze filled with resentment and confusion as she looked at me. She hadn't given me a name even when I was a month old. It wasn't until my grandmother called that I got my name. This year's peach blossoms in the old house are in full bloom. Let us call her Peaches, she said. My father didn't care about me as an Omega, so he was indifferent to what name I was given. The car was engulfed in silence. Abelard broke the quiet with some discomfort. I didn't expect Peaches to have such bad luck. My mother suddenly turned to him. "What do you call her?" Abelard was taken aback. He had always called Delilah sister and referred to me by my full name. This had been tacitly accepted in our family. "Peaches is your sister. Your father and I can call her that, but you can't just use her name like that. It's rude." Abelard, who had been spoiled since childhood, was at a loss with my mother's sudden reprimand. He could only awkwardly scratch his nose. "Mom, are we taking sister's ashes back with us?" My mother gave him a cold glance and said nothing. My apartment wasn't very tidy, not at all how one might expect a young female wolf to keep her space. It was a 30 square meter studio with a sofa and coffee table next to the bed. On the coffee table, half of a shriveled pomelo was left uneaten. A blanket was draped over the sofa and the floor was cluttered with scattered books. Abelard had a slight obsession with cleanliness. He clearly wanted to say something, but after glancing at my mother, decided against it. My mother picked up a book at random. It was about psychology. She hesitated for a moment, flipped through a few pages, and suddenly clenched her fingers. The chapters on self-destructive tendencies and family origins were marked with many underlines in pen. These pages, loose and easily flipped through, were clearly read repeatedly. She opened the drawer of the small cabinet next to her. Inside were medical records from the hospital, conversation notes from the psychologist, several empty pill bottles, and at the bottom, a small stack of travel tickets, mostly to popular attractions and destinations. The room was small, cramped with 4 people, and the atmosphere was thick and heavy, pressing down on them with a silent, oppressive weight. Delilah couldn't stand it any longer. Pointing to the top ticket for a popular attraction, she forced a cheerful tone. At least Peachy had some good times before she passed. She visited more places than any of us. It was one of the many tactics she used on me. She would casually mention in front of family how my life was always filled with joy, contrasting it with how I appeared to outsiders, always pleasant and well-behaved, unlike the hysterics and conflicts at home. It was her way of justifying my perceived coldness and ingratitude. But today, that tactic failed. My mother abruptly turned, her gaze cold and terrifying. "Mother." Before Delilah could utter another word, a sharp slap landed on her face. She was stunned. My father, who had always favored Delilah, quickly moved to protect her, frowning as he said, "Why hit her? Can't we talk things out?" My mother held the conversation notes from my sessions with the psychologist. "When did you begin self-harming?" "After starting middle school. Once, when Mom touched my head, I reflexively pushed her hand away, causing her to almost get hit by a car. I remember her hateful look. She finally started being kind to me, and I couldn't appreciate it. I was just a thankless, ungrateful child." "Do you feel a lack of belonging in your family? Why do you feel like you're unnecessary?" "When I was 5, my sister, I said I should die along with my brother. If it weren't for me, she would be an only child, receiving all of Mom and Dad's love. My mother also said that I was born so inherently wicked that I killed my brother the moment we were born." "Do you frequently have suicidal thoughts? Is there any?" Her lips quivered as if enveloped by a delayed and growing agony. "You act so obedient in front of us." Her voice was filled with bewilderment. "What have you been saying about Peaches? Behind our backs?" My father disapproved. "Peaches was always unlucky. Delilah didn't say anything wrong." "Be quiet," my mother shouted, her face flushing with an unnatural redness. Abelard, concerned for her health, hurried to support her. "Dad, you know Mom has a heart condition. Peaches is dead. No matter what, you shouldn't hit Delilah." My father's eyes narrowed. Delilah seemed stunned by the slap. She looked at my mother and then suddenly displayed a sweet but malicious smile, like a flower whose petals oozed poison. "Mom, don't you remember? I was just a child back then, and you were the one who told me that Peaches caused our brother's death." Abelard erupted in anger. "Delilah, how dare you speak to Mom like that?" They stood facing each other, clearly divided into 2 camps. In my tiny room, they argued and blamed each other over my death. I floated on the sofa, coldly observing it all, until the doorbell rang. It was the landlady, an elderly woman who had always been kind to me and often reminded me of my grandmother. She lived upstairs and opened the door with wide eyes, asking, "Who are you? Where is Peaches?" The soundproofing in this building wasn't very good. It couldn't contain the emotions of 4 people arguing loudly. She valued quiet, and during my time here, there had rarely been any noise. Upon hearing her question, the 4 people inside suddenly fell silent, as if someone had choked their voices. After a long pause, my mother spoke. "We are Peach's family. She has passed away, and we're here to sort out her things." The landlady was stunned and disbelieving, eventually breaking into tears. As she went upstairs, she murmured through her sobs, "What a wonderful girl. How could she have been so unfortunate?" "I have never been particularly fortunate. From birth until now, it's always been the same." Interrupted by the landlady's arrival, they could no longer argue and began to silently pack up my belongings. There was nothing much to pack. I left this world with nothing. I had only one thing weighing on my mind, but Mom wouldn't even spare a thought for me. In the end, my mother sat by the sofa, flipping through the medical records. It was dusk again. The blood-red light of the setting sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow in the room. Car horns could be heard from outside. Her movements slowed, and her expression grew distant. Was she remembering something? Perhaps that evening by the roadside when she had held me close and I had pushed her away slightly. She had withdrawn her love with an impatient gesture. She was always so stingy with her affection towards me. Is this my fault? My mother's voice was rough as she closed the record. She was always difficult, not close to me. Among the 3 children, of course, I preferred the one who was closer to me. No, mother, you're wrong. You've got the cause and effect mixed up. When I was first brought back home, I instinctively sensed your coldness and kept testing the waters. Delilah offered to help with the housework and you smiled and said, "What can a child do? Go and rest." I offered to wash the dishes and you eagerly agreed. But when I broke a plate, you scolded me for being clumsy, poking my forehead. "Mom," I said again, my voice hoarse, speaking words they couldn't hear. The fragmented sobs in my tone were impossible to conceal. "Mom, you brought me into this world and I didn't understand anything. The way you loved me, I loved you in return. My love was a mirror reflecting yours. Everything." The cold sarcasm and the hysterical outbursts I learned were all from you. In this family, your significance to me was different from everyone else's. I spent 10 months in your womb connected by blood. That connection lingered even after my birth. An unbreakable thread, so that even when I was miles away, it still tugged at me, faint but persistent. Even after I died, this invisible force drew me back and my soul returned to you. I tried to convince myself that the world was vast, life was broad, and I need not be trapped by an unhappy family. I went to see the mountains, the sea. I put away my sharp edges. I took my medication regularly. But when I passed through certain cities and saw a little girl in a theme park clutching a red balloon and holding her mother's hand, I would still freeze, watching her. Just like in elementary school when my desk mate proudly told me about a little girl. She had failed a test and her mother had scolded her. She ran away from home, and when her mother found her, she held her and cried, saying she was afraid of losing her and promised not to scold her again. At that time, I didn't understand. Only loved children could have such moments. So once again, when I was locked in the storage room for a time out by my mom, I suddenly pushed open the door and ran away. I had left home. Sitting on an old swing in the park, I gazed at the sparse stars in the night sky, rehearsing in my mind what I would say if mom came looking for me out of worry. After all, she was my mom. I didn't want her to be too sad. I would tell her to be a bit kinder to me in the future. But I waited until midnight. The clouds covered the moon and the sky began to drizzle. Even the moon goddess seemed to urge me to go home. Soaked through, I returned to the house. The entire house was eerily quiet. Everyone was asleep. Who would come looking for me? I knew they wouldn't care. In their eyes, I was just an omega who would be of no consequence even if I disappeared. The next morning, as I walked out with my backpack, Mom was sitting at the dining table, eating breakfast. She said coldly, "You came back, huh? I thought you were going to stay away forever. We wouldn't have an extra mouth to feed from then on. Only loved children dare to be spoiled, to have the right to act petulant." I never escaped the strange cycle of childhood. Since I was 5, I had been tumbling aimlessly through a world without guidance. I could easily get along with anyone, yet received no concern from my family. I asked my mom many times why. I practically begged her for love. I didn't need her to love me the most. Just a little bit would suffice. Like she did with Abelard and Delilah. "You're capable of love. Why couldn't you show it to me? Why?" There was no answer. As night fell, she turned to the next page. Before she could even take a look, Alpha Gabriel called again. "Sorry, Luna, your daughter still has some belongings here. Could you please come by and collect them when you have a moment?" Mom and Abelard went out together. Street lights flickered on outside. She walked for a while, head bowed, and suddenly asked Abelard, "Do you think Peaches hated me?" No, she wouldn't. Abelard was visibly startled, and after several seconds, he managed to say in a strained voice, "Mom, after all, you gave birth to her like that Beta Colin said. She was calling for you before she died. How could she possibly blame you?" He fell silent abruptly. Abelard was 18 now. He wasn't a child who didn't understand. He had never liked me much, though his dislike was less obvious and direct than Delilah's malice. Most of the time, he stood silently behind Delilah, supporting her. But a child's behavior is simply a reflection of the authority held by the adults in the family. Without our parents' tacit approval, Abelard and Delilah wouldn't have dared to target me so. I followed them back to the Silver Blade pack. For the second time, Alpha Gabriel handed Mom a bag of belongings. Inside were a set of keys, a pack of tissues, a phone with a cracked screen, and a blood-stained, broken gemstone necklace. Tucked within the bag was a crumpled card. "Happy birthday, Mom." Moonlight streamed through. Mom stared blankly at the gemstone necklace and the smudged writing on the card. After a long while, water misted in her eyes, gazing into the eyes that had always been either cold or intensely emotional. On the 7th day after my death in my 20th year, my mother finally shed a tear for me for the very first time. Rewind the clock. A month ago. After receiving that call, the next day at work, a colleague from the medical department told me she was pregnant. "I hope it's a girl," she said, resting her hand on her still flat belly, her lips curved in a soft smile. "I've always wanted a daughter. Ever since I got pregnant, I've been craving oranges, so I think I'll call her Orange." She was the most dedicated female werewolf at work. Yet, when she spoke of her child, her expression was a serene gentleness I had never seen before. Noticing me staring, she turned to me and asked, "Peaches, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I shook my head. That night, I had a dream about before I was born. My mom had discovered she was pregnant, gently resting her hand on her belly. She said, "Peachy, let us name you Peachy. I craved peaches so much when I was carrying you." It was the love I had imagined, the love of dreams. I went to see the doctor again. He said, "If you can't move forward, try going back and see if that helps." Some things couldn't be eased by medication alone, they had become demons trapping my heart. I bought that gemstone necklace. In 2 months, it would be my mom's birthday. The saleswoman cheerfully asked, "Would you like to write a greeting card for your mom?" I said yes and took the pen from her hand. I thought, I'll try again. I'll try once more. I'm no longer the clueless child I once was, and she has grown old and frail. Maybe we could talk. Pathetically and pitifully, I always have hope. I keep wishing that she could still love me. That day in the rain, I took that call. My fate had already been sealed a month ago. My ashes and belongings were brought back home and placed in a cemetery on the outskirts. My brother, who was my twin, is also buried there. His urn is very small. On the day of the burial, the sky was overcast but no rain fell. My mother stood by the gravestone all day long. Her sorrow and regret were beginning to show. I thought I would feel relief, a sense of liberation. But in reality, as I watched her pain, I felt nothing but endless indifference. The years of pain and emotions seemed to have erupted and exhausted themselves in those few hours. That evening, after my mother returned home, she sat quietly on the sofa. Abelard went back to college, my father went out on patrol, and Delilah returned to the Crescent Pack, settling into her role as Luna. Everyone, after this brief interlude, resumed their own lives. After a long while, my mother suddenly tugged at the corner of her lips, offering a faint smile. "Peachy, now, it's just the two of us left here." The next morning, my mother got up early and went to the market. Since she frequently bought mangoes, the vendor enthusiastically pitched them, saying the mangoes that day were large and fresh. "I guarantee your daughter will love them." My mother stared blankly and said, "My daughter is allergic to mangoes." The vendor looked at her oddly but said nothing more and moved on to the next customer. My mother wandered from stall to stall with her wicker basket. She picked up a carrot and then put it down, picked up some bell peppers and set them aside. Her actions were so peculiar that the vendor gently suggested, "If you're planning to cook something, I can give you some recommendations." I watched her standing there, struggling to remember, her eyes lost and confused. It suddenly dawned on me she didn't know what I liked to eat. Growing up, I had never enjoyed the luxury of choosing my own meals like Delilah did, nor was I picky like Abelard. I had no options, I always ate their leftovers. Finally, the vendor pulled out a small bamboo basket from beneath the counter and placed it in front of my mother. "These are fresh wild mushrooms from the Silver Blade Pack. How about some for cooking?" Silver Blade Pack. Mushrooms. These words seemed like sharp knives piercing her nerves. My mother clutched the small handful of mushrooms, suddenly bent over, and tears began to fall. "Peachy, Peachy." Such an affectionate term was rarely used by her in front of me. But now that I'm dead, how could I possibly hear it? She bought nothing and returned home with the empty wicker basket. After sitting for a while, she stood up and called Delilah. Her tone was icy. "Your piano hasn't been used in 6 months. If you still want it, I'll have someone deliver it to your house. If not, I'll arrange for the scrap collectors to take it away." Delilah suddenly burst into tears. "Mom, what are you doing? Just because I'm married now doesn't mean I'm not part of this family, or that I don't deserve a room at home. Your bedroom is still reserved for you," my mother said flatly. "But Peach's room, I need to clear it out." Delilah fell silent. One cannot foresee the future. The call I made to her before I died, though it did not make her responsible for my death, altered her position in this home in a subtle way. My mother acted swiftly. By the next morning, the piano room was cleared out. She attempted to have a bed and wardrobe identical to the ones I had discarded brought in, but in the end, she couldn't find exact matches. She took out my clothes from the storage room, clothes that had a musty odor, one by one, laid them flat, and hung them in the wardrobe. There weren't many items, and since they were all from my school years, even if I were alive, I wouldn't wear them. Then she went out to find a craftsman to repair the necklace as much as possible and wore it around her neck. My memorial photo was placed in the room, and every morning, the first thing she did after waking up was to clean it meticulously. I didn't understand what she was trying to achieve. Was it compensation? Or was she trying to ease her own conscience? In life, I had desperately sought her love, even a little would have sufficed. But only in death did I receive it. I floated restlessly around the room, wanting to knock the items off the bookshelf, tear up the new bed linens she had bought and throw them away. Like in countless past arguments, I wanted to hurl hurtful, self-destructive words at her. Stop the pretense, Mom. Don't create a false semblance of love to alleviate your guilt. Do you even believe it yourself? But I couldn't say it. Even if I did, she wouldn't hear me. For the first time, I realized how cruel it was to exist as a disembodied spirit. When would I finally dissipate and ascend to heaven? Or would I remain forever trapped in this home that doesn't belong to me, coldly observing their happy lives? Fortunately, an answer soon came. That afternoon, my mom received an unexpected call from Abelard's college. They said Abelard had gotten into a serious fight with a classmate, leaving the other student severely injured. Abelard was facing expulsion and possibly even jail time. Why? He only has 6 months left before graduation. How could he get into a fight with a classmate for no reason? My mom asked, stunned as she held the phone. The school's explanation was polite but vague. It's due to some personal issues. In reality, Abelard's mate had abandoned him for someone else. In disbelief, Abelard confronted him, only to be told by the other wolf, who was holding his new mate's hand with a resigned smile, with your sister's death so recent, who would dare be with you? Enraged, Abelard attacked, transforming into his wolf form. They fought fiercely, and in a moment of rage, Abelard's claws pierced the other wolf's abdomen, leaving him unconscious. Given that Abelard initiated the violence and the other party was more severely injured, expulsion was unavoidable. Despite Abelard being an Alpha's child, the college couldn't overlook the severity of the incident. When Abelard saw my mom, the arrogance he usually displayed vanished, replaced by tears. My mom, remaining calm, sat down to negotiate compensation with the victim's parents. Initially, they were adamant about pursuing legal action and leaving Abelard with a criminal record, even if it meant jail time. Eventually, my mom offered a settlement of $1 million. Although Abelard was expelled, at least he avoided prison. On the way home, Abelard's expression was utterly dejected. He muttered, "Peaches is dead, so what if I'm in a relationship? Can't I live normally?" My mom turned sharply to look at him, her gaze cold and assessing, making Abelard shiver. "What's wrong, Mom?" Abelard asked, confused. My mom shook her head and said hoarsely, "Let us go home." She had Abelard start training with my father to prepare him for the alpha duties he would inherit. Though it was grueling, Abelard knew he had no other choice. However, 3 months into his training, something happened. My father encountered a group of rogues while on patrol. To demonstrate his dominance, he severed the hands of one young wolf whose mate had just given birth. The family lost its sole provider. Retribution may be delayed, but it never fails to arrive. The injured wolf, now healed, led a group of wolves to ambush my father, and in front of everyone, cut off his hands in return. Abelard stood by, numb, watching as his biological father was attacked. He didn't dare intervene, or take the silver blade from the assailant. He only managed to take my father to the hospital and call my mom. I followed her into the hospital, floating behind her as she approached Abelard, who was distraught and helpless. She slapped him across the face. "That's your father. As the alpha heir, couldn't you have stopped it or at least saved him?" Abelard, with red-rimmed eyes, stammered, "But Mom, the wolf had a silver knife." How ironic. He could fight fiercely for his mate and peers, but was too frightened to save the father who cared for him, and intended to pass on the alpha legacy. My father lost his right hand and his left hand was reduced to just 2 fingers. The sight of his bare, mutilated hand was gruesome. He complained of the pain. Mom stared at the blood-stained bandages and suddenly asked, "Do you think Peachy felt worse that night?" She kept calling for me. I didn't hear her. How could I have not heard her? There was no answer. "Mom, how come you understand now?" Some questions remain unanswered for eternity.